Good evening. Today is Saturday, March the 6th, 2021. Hope everybody has had a good day. Today I want to go back in time 246 years to talk about an event that occurred on this day in 1775 concerning a man named Prince Hall. We really don't know what Prince Hall looked like. This is a picture that was drawn of what he allegedly looked like. It appeared in a book published in the early 1900s, but this is not a photograph of any kind. We're not sure um, how authentic it is, but versions of this have appeared many times over the years. The book Prince Hall, Social Reformer by Arthur Diamond presents a very different picture of what Prince Hall might have looked like. Again, we can't be sure. But Diamond writes that on the evening of March 6, 1775, just a month before the start of the American Revolution, Prince Hall led a group of black colonists through the muddy streets of Boston toward the area known as Bunker Hill. The city was quiet, but the silence was misleading. Boston was filled with tension over the upcoming war. A typically unsettling brush between the local colonists and British troops had taken place the previous night at Boston's Old South Church. There, Dr. Joseph Warren, a leading advocate of the anti-British movement, prepared to give a speech in honor of the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. Dr. Joseph Warren, by the way, was a Freemason and would eventually give his life for American independence at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But Diamond writes that, well aware of the tense atmosphere, Prince Hall made sure to choose a route through the back streets as he guided his small band through Boston the next evening. While skirting the garrisons and roadblocks set by the British, the group also watched out for squads of colonial vigilantes. Hall and his companions knew that both the conditions of the colonists and the British had been competing for the allegiance of free blacks. Accordingly, each viewed Hall's party as possible enemies as well as potential friends. And Hall himself was convinced that his race could improve its lot in the 13 American colonies if his people became organized. The way colonial society was set up, it was impossible for blacks to establish their own organization. The only way they could form any sort of movement to promote their welfare was through an existing network. But Prince Hall knew just such a society. It was a fraternal organization, the Order of Free and Accepted Masons. By the late 18th century, the Masons had already formed the world's largest private society. It had originated during medieval times, like mostly out of the Stone Masons Guild and Association of Builders. And by the way, originally, according to many historians, the Freemasons were all involved in the building trade. Stone masons, brick masons, stone cutters. And they became known as free and accepted because they eventually took into the lodges men from other professions who were not actually stone masons, and thus they became known as accepted masons. And over time, the order evolved from operative to speculative, a type of philosophical society. And the chief purpose of Freemasonry, as one member put it in 1735, is to be a man of benevolence, of charity, not sitting down contented while his fellow creatures, but much more of his brethren, are in want, when it is his power, without prejudicing himself or his family, to relieve them. In order to become a Mason, a person must be willing to promote these ideals of friendship and brotherhood. And Hall was convinced that Freemasonry's history of working toward the betterment of man made the society an ideal organization to advance the cause of African American equality. Yet most Masons in the colonies did not share this view. Each time he attempted to join a Masonic lodge, his bid for membership was turned down. Even though these Masons preached brotherhood, they insisted on keeping blacks out of their lodges. And sadly, that's still true some places today. I say some places because it used to be true a lot of places, but that number has greatly dwindled over the years. After being rejected by the colonist lodges, Hall felt he had little chance or little choice but to turn to the British Masons. He sided with the colonies in their growing quest for freedom, yet he was uncertain that blacks could be granted equal rights if the colonies were successful in severing their ties with Mother England. But eventually, this petition was accepted, and we don't know about the motives of the British Masons at the time. We do know it's recorded on the evening of March 6, Hall's party hastened through the streets of Boston toward British Army Lodge number 441, where the British Masons were stationed. Major General Thomas Gage, the governor of Massachusetts, the commander of the British forces in the American colonies, had closed the lodge to all colonists, as he had every other military site. But when Hall and the others arrived, John Batt, a sergeant in the 38th Foot Regiment, warmly greeted them, then locked the door after they had been stepped inside. And a significant moment in American history was about to take place. Prince Hall, his 14 companions, whose names were recorded: Peter Best, Duff Buform, John Canton, Peter Freeman, Thornton Howard, Cyrus Johnbus, Boston Slinger, Cato Speen, Boston Smith, Benjamin Tiber, and Richard Tilley were taking the initial steps to form America's first black institution. Inside the lodge, they paid a small sum for the right to be initiated into the order of free and accepted Masons. And so this was the beginning of what turned out to be a very great and important institution that survives to this day. It was on 246 years ago today that this man, Prince Hall, was initiated into Freemasonry. Now, there's all kinds of theories about Prince Hall. It was in 1903, the book, The Official History of Freemasonry Among the Colored People of North America, was published by a man named William H. Grimshaw. Grimshaw was employed at one time as the doorkeeper of the General Reading Room for the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He was not a historian or a scholar. His book is not documented in any way. A friend of mine put it like this. He said that if Grimshaw had any sources other than his own imagination, they were probably of a gossip nature and distorted all the time, or rather distorted over time, which makes sense to me. Prince Hall, according to Grimshaw, was born on September 12, 1748, in Bridgetown, Barbados, the son of a white Englishman named Thomas Prince Hall and a free black woman of French descent. They arrived in Boston in 1770, was a Methodist minister, and that he served um, in the American Revolution. None of that has stood the test of historical research. When Prince Hall died on December 4th, 1807, newspaper accounts of his death list his age as 72, which was indicates that he was born in 1735 rather than 1748. Was he born in Barbados? Maybe, maybe not. Outstanding book, one of the major books in the area, Prince Hall, Life and Legacy, by the late Dr. Charles H. Wesley, tries to answer some of the questions. Dr. Wesley even made a trip to Barbados to try to find records of Prince Hall's birth, and he found none. And so we don't know exactly where he was born. Some have said England, some have said Africa, some have said Boston. Grimshaw was doing his best to establish the claim that Prince Hall was freeborn. There is another theory that he was actually born in slavery to a man named William Hall, and that he was freed around 1770. Again, maybe, maybe not. We do know that there were more than one person in the Boston area at the time named Prince Hall. And my late friend Joseph A. Walks Jr., a mentor of mine, a pioneer in Prince Hall Masonic scholarship, his book, Black Square and Compass, deals with a lot of these issues. And he was of the opinion that Prince Hall was born free. The late Jerry Marcingill, a white scholar of Prince Hall Masonry in the Grand Lodge of Iowa, disagreed with that matter because of the name Prince, which was a much more common name, often given to slaves and pets. Well, Joseph Walks's rebuttal to that is that while the name Prince was more often used for blacks, it was not unheard of to find white people with the first name of Prince. There was even a white man in Boston at that time known as Prince F. Hall. Again, a lot of theories here. And he was initiated in 1775, became the first worshipful master of African Lodge number 459 in Boston. And he We know that African Lodge number 459 applied for a charter from the Mother Grand Lodge of England. They applied on September 29th. Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly when they applied, but the charter was issued on September 29th, 1784. But it didn't arrive in Boston until April 29th, 1787. The original charter was damaged badly in a fire, but it was saved, and it's held in a bank vault in Boston. And every 10 years, the Conference of Prince Hall Grand Masters holds their meeting in Boston, in which they go to the bank and are able to view the charter. Then it's put in safekeeping again until 10 years later. And Prince Hall died on December 4th, 1807, buried in Copp's Hill Burying Ground in Boston. And a lot of different Grand Lodges bear his name and have for many years. The African Lodge number 459, along with a number of other American lodges, was dropped from the English rolls in 1813 at the time of two rival Masonic organizations known as the Ancients and the Moderns settled their differences and formed the United Grand Lodge of England. And dates of organization include the following: Pennsylvania 1797, Massachusetts 1827, New York 1845, Maryland 1845, District of Columbia 1848, New Jersey 1848, Ohio 1849, Delaware 1849, California 1855, Ireland, Indiana 1856, Rhode Island 1858, Louisiana 1863. Then notice that's the first one in the South. Michigan 1865, Virginia 1865, Kentucky 1866, Missouri 1866, Illinois 1867, South Carolina 1867, North Carolina 1870, Florida 1870, Georgia 1870, Tennessee 1870, Alabama 1872, Mississippi 1873, Arkansas 1873, my home state of Texas 1875, Kansas 1875, Colorado 1876, West Virginia 1877, Iowa 1881, Oklahoma 1893, Minnesota 1894, Washington 1903, Nebraska 1919, Arizona 1920, New Mexico 1921, Wisconsin 1952, Oregon 1960, Alaska 1969, and Nevada 1980. All of these trace their lineage to African Lodge number 459 in Boston, where Prince Hall was the first worshipful master. And it was between 1871 and 1873, under the leadership of Captain William D. Matthews, Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge, and a resident of Leavenworth, Kansas, that the following lodges were established in Texas: San Antonio Lodge number 22, Mount Bonnell Lodge number 23 in Austin, Magnolia Lodge number 24 in Houston, Galveston Lodge number 25 in Galveston, Mount Lebanon Lodge number 26 in Brenham. These lodges came together in June of 1875 to organize what eventually became known as the, well, actually, it was in August 19th of 75. They formed the most worshipful Grand Lodge, free and accepted ancient York Masons of Texas, now known as the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. And I've been to St. John AME Church in Brenham, where a monument's right across the street to mark the place where that meeting was held. All that's documented in my book, Prince Hall, Freemasonry in the Lone Star State, from Cuny to Curtis, 1875 to 2003. Norris Wright Cuny of Galveston, here's this picture right here, was the first Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. Wilbert M. Curtis of Waco is the current Grand Master. There have been a total of 21 Grand Masters since the Grand Lodge was organized. It was organized in 1875, 100 years after the initiation of Prince Hall. Prince Hall was a great man. He did a number of things work-wise. He was reportedly a leather dresser by trade. He also did some catering on the side. He was a full member of the Congregational Church that met on School Street in Boston. He was a staunch abolitionist who spoke out very fervently against slavery, and he did all he could to advocate education for African American children in Boston and throughout Massachusetts. And the many efforts at social justice and education and other worthwhile causes advocated from the very beginning by Prince Hall Masons hark back to the spirit of Prince Hall, the man who was initiated into Masonry on March the 6th, 1775. I'm a member of the Philaxis Society, Prince Hall Masonic Research Society, founded by Brother Walks, who passed away in 2006. And we just completed our first virtual convention. I've been at a number of conventions over the years. This is the first one I've been to since 2010, when my wife and I drove to Pine Bluff, Arkansas for a very interesting meeting. But the Philaxis Society is a society for Prince Hall Freemasons who seek more light and who have light to impart. And this, the spirit of Prince Hall and his importance as a leader, not only of Freemasonry, but of the African American community. And in his book on the history of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Louisiana, Brother Walks wrote, "The history of Prince Hall Freemasonry is in reality the history of the black experience in America. In fact, if one wanted to explore black history, one could do so equally well by pursuing the proceedings of the various Prince Hall Grand individual lodges. The black church, black educational institutions, the black press, and in later years, black civil rights organizations may have publicly perceived as the hegemony of Black America. The perception may have been misleading, for none of the Black institutions could match the quiet, determined, persistent role of leadership that came from the Masonic Lodge of Prince Hall Freemasonry. Were all the leaders of the African American community throughout the years Prince Hall Masons? Certainly not, but a great percentage of them were. Many institutions, the church, the schools, the press, many African Americans who served in government, many were come from the ranks of Prince Hall Freemasons. So the organization has made some major positive contributions and still does, even though the interest in Masonry and other organizations like this are not as great as it used to be. Nevertheless, this is a tribute to Prince Hall, a truly great man who started this institution today in 1775 and who left a rich legacy to which all can benefit from. Have a good evening.